Shalom Aleichem, and welcome to the Shiur in Likkutei Sichos, Chelek Tezayin, Parshas Boy Sichos. This is the Ion Shiur. In this Sicha, we are going to focus on the Shita of the Rambam in the Mitzvos of Korbon Pesach, and hopefully try to explain the oimek of the Shita of the Rambam, and with that, answer many of the questions that are asked on this Rambam. So, we're going to start with taking a look in Sefer HaMitzvos, in the Mitzvos Asay, Mitzvah Nun Hey, and Mitzvah Nun Vav. In Mitzvah Nun Hey, the Rambam writes, VaMitzvah Nun Hey, Hisha Tzivonu Lishchait Se HaPesach B'Yom 14 Min Nisan. This is the mitzvah to shecht the sheep of the Korbon Pesach, B'Yom 14 Min Nisan. And this is what the Torah says in our Parshas Boy, that it should be shechted, all the Yidden should shecht it on the 14th Bein Ha'arbayim. If a person was over on this tzivui, b'mezid, and they were not makrib the Korbon Pesach when they were supposed to, bismanoi, they're chayiv kares. So that was mitzvah nun hey. Then mitzvah nun vav. Va mitzvah hanun vav, hisha tzivonu lechel keves ha-pesach lel chamisha osar min Nisan bitnoav hanizkarim. This is the mitzvah to eat keves ha-pesach on the night of chamisha osar min Nisan with the conditions mentioned in the Torah, v'sheyitzli, etc., etc. So we have mitzvah nun hey, shchitas Korbon Pesach, and mitzvah nun vav, the mitzvah of achilas Korbon Pesach. Now, there is a sefer called Ma'aseh Nisim. In Ma'aseh Nisim, we have hasogos, arguments on the Rambam from Rabbi Daniel Habavli, and answers that were given to his questions by Rabbi Avraham ben Harambam. So here, Rabbi Daniel Habavli has a problem with the Rambam. This you can find actually in the Rambam Maduras Frankel, all the way in the back, Sefer HaMitzvos, on page Tov Nun Aleph. So Rabbi Daniel Habavli says like this, in Shaila Hey, Vizbainanti b'masha zocharei b'perek hayud aleph misper zeh, shekol ma she'omu b'yachachomim loshen shadover ha'pleini v'ha'pleini ma'akvin zeh ezeh, mevur shei mitzvah achas. That the Rambam writes, whenever you have two things that are ma'akiv, two parts of a mitzvah, or two seemingly mitzvahs, but they are ma'akiv, then you have to treat them as one mitzvah. Kamay arbas minyan shebelulav, for example, the 4 minim in the lulav, that they're not 4 different mitzvahs, since they're all ma'akiv each other. If you're missing one, you're not yaitza. So all 4 are required to have the mitzvah. So therefore, it's one mitzvah. Likewise, v'lechem aponim im levayno zaka. The lechem aponim with levayno zaka, since levayno zaka is ma'akiv, so we don't consider levayno zaka to be a separate mitzvah. It's one mitzvah with a lechem aponim. Okay, let's skip a few lines. Harei ze mevur shei mitzvah achas. V'chein kol ma sheyizbor lecha she'atachlis ha'mevukosh likewise, anytime the tachlis which you're seeking will not be achieved through one chelek, you need all the chalakim together to achieve the tachlis, so then also it's one mitzvah. So that's what the Rambam himself writes in the Klolei HaMitzvos. So v'kasha li, so now Reb Daniel Habavli says, oy bazoi, yes, a kasha. When it comes to eating the Korbon Pesach, the mitzvah of eating the Korbon Pesach, whether or not achila, the eating of the Korbon Pesach, is ma'akiv, the actual hakrovas hakorbon, is a machlokes tanoim. It's a machlokes between Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Nosson on one hand, and Rabbanon on the other hand. According to Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Nosson, achilas Korbon Pesach is not ma'akiv the hakrovas hakorbon, which means that if a person was makriv the Korbon Pesach ki hilchasa, And then, for whatever reason, Belel Chamisha also, they did not eat it. So the fact that you didn't eat it doesn't undo the mitzvah of the Hakravas HaKorbon. The Hakravas HaKorbon, that mitzvah you were Yaitza. Lamaisa, you were Makiv the Korban Pesach on Yud Dalet Bein Ha'arbaim. So that inyan is B'shleimus. And the fact that later you didn't eat, so Taka, you're missing the mitzvah of Achilas Korban Pesach. But by not eating, it doesn't undo the mitzvah of the Hakravas HaKorbon. That's the shit of Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Nosson, that Achilas HaPesach is not Ma'akiv the Korban. But the Rabbanan say no. Achilas Korban Pesach is Ma'akiv the Hakravas HaKorbon. If you didn't eat the Korban Pesach, then sefelt in the Hakravas HaKorbon. You're not Yaitze even bringing the Korban Pesach on your dalet. The Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Nosson Omri loy Ma'akva. Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Nosson say it's not Ma'akiv, and the Chachamim say it is Ma'akiv. So here we have, he's going to go through two examples. Both of these examples are mentioned in the Sichos. What's the first example? Ela afilu basar tamei v'chelev kayom. Let's say you shechted the Korban Pesach, and for whatever reason the basar, the psar HaKorban became tamei, but the chelev is kayom. You have the chelev, so you could burn the chelev on the mizbeach. The basar is tamei. So im zorak es adam, if you went ahead nevertheless and you spritzed the blood, you did the zrikas adam. So even though the basar will not be able to be eaten because the basar is tamei, nevertheless, says Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Nosson, hurtza. Hurtza means the korban was niskabel. The korban is a kosher korban. You were makriv the korban, you were yaitz the Korban Pesach, even though you won't be able to eat the basar because the basar is tamei, nevertheless, the korban is a good korban. That's one example. And the Chachamim in that case would say no. The Chachamim would say, since the basar is tamei and the basar cannot be eaten, so even if you went ahead and you spritzed the blood, you did zrikas adam, lamaisa, you're not yaitza the korban. Even the Korban Pesach, the Hakravas HaKorbon, you're not yaitza, because you won't be able to eat, and the achila is ma'akiv. Now another example. Let's say a group of people were counted in for a certain sheep, right? So a certain group of people were counted in for a certain sheep. And then another group of people came and joined, and they also counted themselves into the korban. So now we have a situation where we have too many people counted in on this korban, and there isn't going to be enough for each person to have a kezayis. To be yaitz the mitzvah of achilas Korban Pesach, you have to eat a kezayis of basar. But now, because we have a second group of people that joined, so the achronim, the second group, there is not enough for them to each have a kezayis of basar. So again, they won't be able to eat. So what's the halacha? So the shita of Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Nosson is yatzu yedei chayvasen bezrikas adam. Even the second group of people that won't be able to eat a kezayis of basar, so they're going to miss out on the mitzvah of achila, but they were yaitze their chayva of bringing the Korban Pesach, the Hakravas HaKorbon, that they were yaitze. So even without eating, they're mekayim the mitzvah of Hakravas HaKorbon. Rabbanan savri achilas basar ma'akva. However, the Rabbanan say no. In both cases, achilas basar is ma'akiv. Eating is ma'akiv the hakrava. And therefore, v'imnitma basar v'zarakas adam loy hurtza. In the first case, if the basar became tamei and you spritz the blood, loy hurtza. You're not mekayim the mitzvah of the Hakravas HaKorbon. You are not yaitze the korban. V'chayiv Pesach Sheni, and therefore you will be chayiv to make a Pesach Sheni. You spritz the blood, but since the basar is tamei and you won't be able to eat, achilos ma'akiv. V'chein, this also the second case, nimnu v'chazu v'nimnu v'chulu. According to the Rabbanon, achroinim, the second group who don't have enough for a kezayis for each of them, lo yatzu, they won't be yaitze for the same reason. Since they won't be able to eat a kezayis, they won't be mekayim the mitzvah of achila. Achila is ma'akiv the korban, and therefore they were not yaitze even the Hakravas HaKorbon. V'chayav in lasa is Pesach Sheni. So therefore the achroinim, the second group, would be chayiv to make a Pesach Sheni because they were not yaitze the Korban Pesach Rishon. So continues Reb Daniel Hababli that the V'hu Atzmei Pasek Rabbanon, and the Rambam paskins like the Rabbanon in both cases. Da Achila Ma'akva. In both cases, sign the case where the basar became tamei, and you still spritz the blood. The Rambam paskins, you're not yaitze. The korban is considered to not have been brought. There's no hakravas hakorban, because since you won't have an achila, therefore you have no korban either. And he also paskins in the case of the menuyin, if the menuyin are too many, and there won't be a kezais for each one, they're not yaitze even the korban. So kum tachais that the Rambam paskins like the Rabban, and that achilas Korbon Pesach is ma'akiv. If you don't eat the Korbon Pesach, you're also not yaitze the Korbon Pesach, the korban part. V'imkein havi lo shchitas haPesach azurikas domi v'achilas kulon mitzvah achas. So then it comes out, says Reb Daniel Hababli, that according to the Rambam's own principle, that if you have two chalakim of a mitzvah that are ma'akev each other, like the daled minim shebelulav, or the lechem aponim and the levoino zaka, that since without one of them, you're not mekayim the whole mitzvah. Each chelak is ma'akev. Therefore, we don't consider it two different mitzvahs. We consider it one mitzvah. So then here also, since the Rambam paskins like the Rabbanon, that achilas haPesach is ma'akiv the shchitas haPesach, so then we should consider the shchita with the zrika, with the achila, to be all one mitzvah. Why is the Rambam dividing it into two mitzvahs? Mitzvah nun hey shchitas Korbon Pesach, mitzvah nun vav achilas Korbon Pesach. Why should it be two mitzvahs, since these two chalakim are ma'akiv? Without the achila, you're not mekayim the shchita, so it should be one mitzvah. And he even quotes a Mishnah. The Mishnah says in Sachim, this lashon that Pesach mitchilasei lo ba ela la'achila. So if the Pesach lo ba mitchilasei ela la'achila, so zicher should not be two different mitzvahs. We shouldn't have two different mitzvahs, mitzvahs ashchitas haPesach and mitzvahs achilas haPesach. It should be one mitzvah. Okay, let's do a little bit of a skip. And Veloy. Now he continues. Veloy ela afilu Rabbi Yeshua v'Rabbi Nosson. The savri achila loy ma'akva. They said the question is even further. The question is not only the shittas Rabbanon that achila is ma'akiv, but even the shittas Rabbi Yeshua v'Rabbi Nosson that say achila loy ma'akva. As we said before, that even if you cannot eat the Korbon Pesach, that does not disturb the mitzvah of the hakrava, and you're still mekayim the mitzvah of hakravas Korbon Pesach. So even according to them, still meidim the Pesach loiba mitchilasei ela la'achila. They still agree to the principle that we said before, that a Pesach loiba mitchilasei ela la'achila. Which is why if everybody's tamei, if the whole tzibur is tamei, we're still making the Korbon Pesach and we eat the Korbon Pesach, unlike other korbanos. So, if even Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Nosson agree that a Pesach leiba mitchilasei ela la'achila, so then even u'midivreim yatzu the sarvila mitzvah achas. So then even they would agree that it should still be one mitzvah. In other words, we can say that Reb Daniel Hababli is really asking two questions, or he's asking the question from two different arguments. The first argument is that if achilas Pesach is ma'akiv the shchita, then it should be one mitzvah. That's one shayla. And secondly, even if you want to tell me, like Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Nosson, that achilas Pesach is not ma'akiv, fine. But still, lemaise, since haPesach loiba mitchilasei ela la'achila, the whole purpose of the Korbon Pesach, the point is the achila. That's the whole point. Even they agree, take the achila is not ma'akiv. Okay. But lemaise, the whole point of the Korbon Pesach is that we should eat it. So since the whole point is that we should eat it, so even they would agree that it should be one mitzvah. So why then is the Rambam counting shchitas haPesach and achilas haPesach as two different mitzvahs? So this is the kasha or the kushiyos that Reb Daniel Hababli asks on the Rambam. So before we look at the answer of Rabbi Avram ben Harambam, let's first mention some of the other questions that are addressed in the Sicha. Some of them directly in the Sicha, and some of them in the Ha'aris. Okay, so now let's step away from the Korbon Pesach for a second, and let's think about Korbanos in general. There are many different Korbanos that we bring, and just as an example, we'll focus on Korban Chatos. So how does the Rambam codify the mitzvahs by Korbanos in general? So if you look a little bit further in Sefer HaMitzvahs, the Rambam basically counts 3 mitzvahs when it comes to Korbanos in general. Mitzvah Samach Gimel, Samach Dalid, Samach Hey, and Samach Vav is, we'll just read quickly, Samach Gimel Shetzivonu b'maisa Korban Oila. Mitzvah Samach Dalid Shetzivonu Shiyeh Maisa Korban Chatos ala Toyer HaNizkar. Samach Hey Shetzivonu Shiyeh Maisa Korban HaOsham ala Toyer HaNizkar. Mitzvah Samach Vav Shetzivonu Shiyeh Maisa Zavach HaShlomim ala Toyer HaNizkar. And then he summarizes ve'elu ha'arba maisim kloima maisi ha'oila ha'chatos v'asham v'ashlomim hey maisi ha'karbonos kulam. That includes all the karbonos. So basically we have a mitzvah, 4 mitzvahs, 1 for each type of korban, and the mitzvah there is to perform the procedure for each korban the way the Torah describes it. When you bring a korban oila, follow the procedure that the Torah says for korban oila. Same thing for chatos, same thing for asham, same thing for shlom. So that is one mitzvah that we have by Korbanos. The mitzvah to perform the procedure as it is described in the Torah. The Shechita, Kabbalah, Zrika, Haktorah, etc., etc. Okay, a little bit further, mitzvah Samach Tes, looking at, let's say, Korban Chatos. Hisha tzivonu sheyakriv kol mi sheshogag bechet min hachatoim hagdolim hayeduim Korban Chatos. The mitzvah on a person who did an Aveira, a person needs to be makriv a korban chatos. Mitzvah 70, the next mitzvah is the Asham Tolui, and then mitzvah Ein Aleph, a regular korban Asham. So the second mitzvah we have by korbanos is the mitzvah on the bailim, the mitzvah on the person to bring the korban. Call it Havoas HaKorban. Okay, so we've had a mitzvah to perform the procedure by each korban the way the Torah describes it. That was one mitzvah. Then we have a mitzvah on the Baal, on the person to bring a korban, lahovias korban, havoas korban. And then lastly, we have mitzvah peites, hishetziva hakohanim lechel besar kochim, kloimar achatos v'asham shem kochim, etc., etc. The mitzvah of achilas hakochim, that the kohanim should eat from the korbanos. So these are the 3 mitzvahs that we have by korbanos in general. The mitzvah lasos kol maisei hakorban ketoyer hanizkar b'Torah. The second mitzvah by the korbanos is to bring havoas hakorban, to bring the korban, and the third mitzvah is to eat, for the kohanim to eat from the korbanos. So stellt sich hashaila, why by Korban Pesach is the Rambam being meshana from his own Seder? The Rambam's system by Korbanos in general is that he has a mitzvah to bring the korban on the person, Havoas HaKorban, then a mitzvah, let's say, for the Kohanim to perform the Maaseh HaKorban, which is the Shechita, the Kabbalah, the Zrika, the Haktorah, the way the Torah describes, and then a mitzvah for the Achilas HaKorbanos. So why by Korban Pesach is the Rambam being meshana from the Seder? And instead, all of a sudden, the Rambam introduces a mitzvah of Shechita HaPesach, mitzvah Lishchait. By none of the other Korbanos, he doesn't say anywhere there's a mitzvah Lishchait. There's no mitzvah of Shechita specifically. As we said before, there's a mitzvah of Hava, a mitzvah Lasa is called Maaseh HaKorban, and a mitzvah of Achila. So why by Korban Pesach, all of a sudden, is the Rambam introducing a mitzvah of Shechita HaPesach? And taka, the other Monei HaMitzvahs the Rebbe brings, like the Bahag and the Yereim, they don't say that the mitzvah by Korban Pesach is Shechita HaPesach. They say the mitzvah is Lasis Kol Maaseh HaPesach, to perform the whole Maaseh of the Korban Pesach. They don't single out Shechita. And they taka, don't learn from the pasuk in our Parsha V'shachatu Oisoi, like the Rambam. They bring a pasuk from Parshas Ba'aloischa, where it says V'yasu b'nei Yisrael es HaPesach, which is actually after Matan Torah. So why the Rambam all of a sudden is saying a mitzvah of Shechita, of Shechita HaKorban? Secondly, the Rambam doesn't mention Havoas HaKorban. Doesn't say the mitzvah Lahovi Korban Pesach. The Rambam doesn't mention Lasis Kol Maaseh Korbon Pesach. He doesn't mention that either. What happened to all the other parts of the Avodah? As we said, the Kabbalah, the Zrika, the Haktorah. Why is that not included in the Mitzvos of Korbon Pesach? Just Shchita and Achila. What about Kol Maaseh Korbon Pesach? Where is that? And thirdly, why is the Rambam making a mitzvah of Achilas Korbon Pesach a mitzvah b'fnei atzma, if by all the other Korbanos the Rambam includes Achilas HaKorbanos all in one mitzvah? Eating Korbanos is one mitzvah, as we said before. Mitzvah Peites is eating from all the Korbanos, so that should include Korbon Pesach as well. It's a mitzvah to eat from all the Korbanos, and Korbon Pesach is a Korban, so you have to eat it also. Why is the Rambam making Achilas Korbon Pesach a mitzvah b'fnei atzma? So these are some more questions that arise, that come up in the Shitta of the Rambam, and in the Hemshech of the Shiur, once we understand the Oimek Shittas of Rambam, all of this will be clarified. But for now, let's return to the Kashas of Reb Daniel Habavli. So, Reb Avram ben Rambam is going to answer the Kashas of Reb Daniel Habavli. Now, he doesn't set it up in this way, but L'Tayeles, the Havana of the Sugya, and for clarity, I'm going to explain it in the following way. As we said before, the Kasha of Reb Daniel Habavli is really a two-part question. Firstly, the fact that Achilas Korbon Pesach is ma'akiv the Shchita, the Shittas Rambam, and if it's ma'akiv, then it should be one mitzvah. And secondly, even if it's not ma'akiv, but since HaPesach leiba mitchilasei elo la'achila, so since the point is achila, so even if it's not ma'akiv, it should be one mitzvah. So keneged these two kashas, Rabbi Avram ben Rambam brings two different points. Let's start with the point that l'chayra, according to the Rambam, who passes like the Rabbanon, achila is ma'akiv. Achila is ma'akiv. That if you don't eat, you're not mekayim even the mitzvah of the Korbon Pesach itself. So this is the point which he addresses secondly. He says, va'oid, furthermore, this is the answer of Rabbi Avram ben Rambam. Shchitas HaPesach, mitzvah sheyesh ba koros. When it comes to Shchitas HaPesach, as the Rambam said, this is a mitzvah sheyesh ba koros. If you don't do this mitzvah, b'mezid, b'zmano, you're chayiv koros. However, v'achilosoi, the eating of the Korbon Pesach is k'moy shar ha-mitzvahs asay she'ein ba koros. Achilas Korbon Pesach belel chamisha osur b'nisan, that is just a regular mitzvah asay, and there's no koros for that. If a person does not do that, they're not chayiv koros. Shaharei, ilu korav ha-pesach bizmanoi, if a person was makiv the Korbon Pesach bizmanoi, ki hilchasa, right? On Yud Dalet Bein Harbayim, you did everything. Everything kahalacha, and you shechted the Korbon Pesach, and you were makiv the Korbon Pesach, everything was good. And then for whatever reason, v'nimna mila achlei leilei chamisha asar, and for whatever reason you didn't eat it, leil chamisha asar, says Rabbi Avram ben Rambam, harei ze kayim hachiyuv b'shchita, harei ze kiyim hachiyuv b'shchita. Even the Rambam will agree that it's not ma'akiv. You were makayim the chiyuv of shchita, upotu min hakoros, upotu mi Pesach sheni. Even the Rambam will agree that if you shechted the Korbon Pesach kilchasa on Yudalit and you didn't eat it leil chamisha asar for whatever reason, it's not that the achila is ma'akiv the shchita and you were not yaitze the shchita and you're chayiv koros and you're chayiv in Pesach sheni. No. You're potem in hakoros, you're potem in Pesach sheni. Ve'eina k'moshe chashavta shelo yikiyim chayvas hashchita elei machal. It's not like you, Reb Daniel Habavli, thought that if you don't eat, you're not mekayim the mitzvah of shchita, and you're chayiv koros, and you have to bring a Pesach sheni. Ela shchita kiyem chayvasa im hoyloi beis shchita oichlin ru'uyin. Rather, the pshat in the Rambam is that if you did the shchita ki hilchasa, and beis shchita you had what he calls oichlin ru'uyin, then you were mekayim the mitzvah of shchita, and you're potter from koros, and you're potter from a Pesach sheni, even if later you don't eat the Korbon Pesach. Okay, so now we have to explain this a little bit more. This the Rebbe explains barichus in the Sicha, in footnote in Ha'ara 60. Basically, Rabbi Avram ben Rambam is saying back to Rabbi Daniel Habavli, you're wrong. You think that achila is ma'akiv the shchita. It's not ma'akiv. Pashut making a mistake in halacha. You're learning pshat in the Rambam, pshat in the Gemara wrong. Achila is not ma'akiv. Even if you don't eat, you're still makayim the mitzvah of shchita, and therefore you're potter from kares and you're potter from Pesach Sheni. So, l'chayra, what's going on over here? Wasn't it clear from the Gemara that this is a machlekes tanoim, and the Rambam paskin clearly like the Rabbanon that achila is ma'akiv, the two examples that we had before? How is Rabbi Avram ben Rambam all of a sudden saying that it's not ma'akiv? So the pshat is like this. Let's go case by case. The first example that we have let's go with the example of the menuyin, right? We said the Rambam paskins that if you had one group of people that were counted on the Korbon Pesach, and then a second group came, but there's not enough for the second group to each have a kezayis, so then they're not yotze. The second group is not yotze, and they're not even yotze the shchita, right? They're chayiv to make a Pesach Sheni. So l'chura, this was a raya that the Rambam holds, that the Rabbanon hold, and the Rambam paskins like the Rabbanon, that achila is ma'akiv. If achila is not ma'akiv, so what's the problem? These menuyin were ma'akiv the Korbon Pesach. Fine, they didn't eat it, but they were ma'akiv the Korbon Pesach. So the pshat, according to Rabbi Avram ben Rambam, is like this: that we don't need the achila b'poyel. We don't need an achila b'poyel is not ma'akiv. But what? There's a din in the shchita. There's a din in the shchita that b'shas hashchita it has to be ro'i la'achila. That's the word. This is learned from Gzeras HaKosuv, ish lefi achloi tochaisu alaseh, that b'shas hashchita, for the shchita to be a kosher shchita, b'shas hashchita it has to be ro'i la'achila. And if it's not ro'i la'achila b'shas hashchita, then you're not yotze the mitzvah of shchita. And that's the machlokes between Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Nosson and the Rabbanan. Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Nosson say, no, b'shas hashchita, we don't care about the achila per se. We don't care that it should be ro'i l'achila. If you did the shchita and you were makiv the korban properly, even if during that time there wasn't enough for each person to have a kezayis, but it doesn't matter. So even though b'shas hashchita it wasn't ro'i l'achila, it doesn't matter. You're still yotze the mitzvah of shchita. Mashenkin the Rabbanan say no. One of the dinim in shchita Pesach is that b'shas hashchita it has to be ro'i l'achila. And if it's not ro'i l'achila, for example, there isn't enough for each person to have a kezayis, then sefelt in the mitzvah of shchita, and you're not yotze the mitzvah of shchita. However, if b'shas hashchita everything was fine, as we said before, if the shchita, b'shas hashchita, everything was fine. There was ro'i l'achila, there wasn't too many menuyin, the basa was tahor, the shchita was done ki hilchasa, everything was fine. And then later, for whatever reason, comes Leil Tes Vav, a person didn't eat. Says Rabbi Avram ben Rambam, everybody agrees that that doesn't undermine the shchita. The fact that you didn't eat lepoil later doesn't undo the shchita. It's not ma'akiv the shchita. If the shchita was done ki hilchasa, ki mitzvasa, then you were makayim the mitzvah of shchita l'chol hadayis, and you're potter mikares, and you're potter from Pesach Sheni, you were yotze the mitzvah of shchita. Later you didn't eat. What's such a ton? It's a separate mitzvah. It's a mitzvah to eat lel chamisha asur b'nisan. If you didn't eat lel chamisha asur b'nisan, so you were not makayim the mitzvah of achila. But that has nothing to do with the mitzvah of shchita. The mitzvah of shchita you were makayim, as long as b'shas hashchita it was ro'i la'achila. It was chazi la'achila. So that's in the case of the menuyin. Al derech zeh in the case where the basar became tamei. It's the same thing. In the case where the basar became tamei, the Rabbanon say that even if you went ahead and you were zerek the dam, you're not yotze the mitzvah of the korban. It's for the same reason. Because b'shas hazrika, zrika is a chelik of the korban pesach. B'shas hazrika, it wasn't ro'i l'achila. You wouldn't be able to eat it. So again, sefelt in the ma'aseh hakorban. Ish lefi achlei tachaisu means that b'shas you bring the korban, it has to be chazi l'achila. If it's not chazi la'achila because the basar is tamei, then it's a din in the hakravas hakorbon. The hakravas hakorbon, you're not yaitze. So that's the machlokes between the Rabbanon and Rabbi Shiur Rabbi Nosson. Rabbi Shiur Rabbi Nosson say it doesn't matter if it's not chazi la'achila b'shas the hakrava, and therefore even if the basar is tamei l'maisa, you could still be yaitze the korban. But the Rabbanon say no. If the basar is tamei b'shas hakravas hakorbon, then it's felt in the mitzvah of the hakravas hakorbon, because it's not chazi la'achila, you're not mekayim the ish lefi achlei tachaisu, and you're not yaitze the hakrava. So that's the pshat in the shita of the Rabbanon, and that's how the Rambam paskins. But again, the kula alma, if the shchita and the hakrava was done properly, there was no chesroinus b'shas hashchita b'shas hakrava, and then later, for whatever reason, belel chamisha also b'nisan, somebody didn't eat, everybody agrees that achila b'poyel is not ma'akiv. That person who didn't eat was still mekayim the mitzvah of shchitas haPesach, v'akravas haPesach. That person is still potur mi Pesach Sheni. That person is potur mi Kores, because the achila b'poyel is not ma'akiv. So this is how Rabbi Rambam learns pshat in the Rambam. And this is l'chayre a mechudishtike pshat. And not everybody learns this way. The Rebbe brings in a ha'ara from Rav Perlo in his Biur on Sefer HaMitzvos l'Rasag, that there Rav Perlo brings that Rashi and Tosfos don't learn this way. Rashi and Tosfos both learn, he brings Rayas, Rashi and Tosfos both learn Kipshutai, that according to the Rabbanon, Achila is ma'akiv, meaning even if everything was fine, b'shas hashchit and b'shas hakrava, and b'poyel you didn't eat lel chamisha asur b'nisan, the Rabbanon say that Achila is ma'akiv, and you're chayiv kores. You're chayiv kores because you were not mekayim the mitzvah of Korbon Pesach, because achila b'poyel is ma'akiv. Agav, he explains that even then you would not bring a Korbon Pesach sheni. He has rayas and reasons why. Legabi Pesach sheni take, you don't bring a Pesach sheni because lamaisa you brought the Korbon Pesach properly on Pesach Rishon, but since you didn't eat it, Belel Chamisha Asar, the Achila is ma'akiv the mitzvah of Korbon Pesach, and you're still chayiv kores. However, the Rambam, according to Rabbi Avram ben Rambam, is understanding no, Achila b'poyel is not ma'akiv. L'kulei alma, even if you don't eat b'poyel, you're mekayim the mitzvah of Korbon Pesach, and you're poter mikores, and you're poter mipesach sheni. The ma'oni machlokes between Rabbanon and Rabbi Nosson of Rabbi Yeshua is if there is a din that it has to be roi lachila b'shas hashchita or not. Also din in the shchita, also din in the hakravas hakorbon, if there is such a din that it has to be roi lachila or not. And in that the Rambam paskins like the Rabbanon, that there is a din achila in the shchita, that b'shas hashchita it has to be roi lachila. But beneged achila b'poyel, the Rambam says that it's not ma'akiv. What does Reb Daniel HaBavli, what's his shita? So the Rebbe says, we can either say that Reb Daniel HaBavli learned like Rav Perlo, like Rashi and Tosfos, that according to the Rabbanon, Achila b'poyel is ma'akiv, and that's how we understood the Rambam. And therefore he was asking, if Achila b'poyel is ma'akiv, why should it be two mitzvahs? It should be one mitzvah. Or the Rebbe says we could even learn that Reb Daniel HaBavli understood pshat already, like Rabbi Avram ben Rambam. He already understood that Achila b'poyel is not ma'akiv, and that they were only arguing if there's a din that it has to be roi la'achila b'shas hashchita, also din in the shchita. He understood that. But that already told him that it should be one mitzvah. If you see that there is a din that b'shas hashchita, it has to be roi la'achila, and if it's not roi la'achila b'shas hashchita, then the shchita is possible, you're not mekayim the mitzvah of akravas hakorbon, then that already told him that it's ma'akiv in inyan. Achila is ma'akiv in inyan. It's ma'akiv b'shas hakorbon, b'shas hashchita, b'shas hakrava, it's ma'akiv that it should be roi la'achila. So then he asks his kasha, it should still be one mitzvah. So we can zog enough tzvei fanim what Reb Daniel HaBavli's svara was. But al kolponim, the Rambam is clear that the Rambam learns Achila b'poyel is not ma'akiv, and therefore the kasha which was asked, that since it's ma'akiv, it should be one mitzvah, is not a kasha. However, as we said before, Reb Daniel HaBavli's kasha on the Rambam is even if you hold it's not ma'akiv, even according to Rabbi Yishuv Reb Nosson, that achila is not ma'akiv, still he has the kasha. Since HaPesach leiba mitchilasei ela la'achila, so even if you say it's not ma'akiv, it should still be one mitzvah. So l'chayra, that is still a kasha. Even if we explain that according to the Rambam, achila b'poyel is not ma'akiv, but still, if HaPesach leiba mitchilasei ela la'achila, it should still be one mitzvah. So this Rabbi Rambam Rambam seems to be answering with another word, and that is, he says like this. Af al pi shashchita choyva shetluya bizman acher mizman choyva so achila shaya shchita mi choyvas yom arba asar v'achila mi choyvas leilei chamisha asar. That basically he wants to answer the reason why it cannot be one mitzvah, even though a Pesach leiba mitchilasei ela la'achila, is because they are in two different zmanim. The mitzvah of the Shichos HaKorbon is b'Yudalid, and the Achilas Korbon Pesach is Leil Chamisha Asar. So since these two things happen in two different zmanim, so therefore even though HaPesach leiba mitchilasei ela la'achila, but since the two stages, the Shechita and the Achila, are on two different zmanim, so that separates them into two different mitzvahs. That's l'chayra how he wants to answer that question. However, the Rebbe asked that this answer doesn't seem to be sufficient because we have many examples of other mitzvahs where there are two components to a mitzvah, and the two components have different zmanim, yet they're included in one mitzvah. I will give three examples. The mitzvah of Kriyat Shema. The mitzvah of Kriyat Shema is twice, once in the morning and once in the evening. And both of these mitzvahs are included in one mitzvah. There's one mitzvah of Kriyat Shema, and that has two parts, to say Kriyat Shema in the morning and to say Kriyat Shema in the evening. So even though they're two different zmanim, and they're also not ma'akiv, so that they're in two different zmanim, but yet it's one mitzvah. One mitzvah of saying Kriyat Shema. So here, another example would be the codifies. We bring codifies in the Beis HaMikdash in the morning and Bein HaArbaim. Also the Korban Tamid is in the morning and Bein HaArbaim. So there's two different zmanim, yet there's one mitzvah of Korban Tamid, there's one mitzvah of codifies. So you see, just because two chalakim happen in two different zmanim doesn't automatically mean that they have to be two different mitzvahs. So likewise over here, what does it help to tell me that the Shechita is on Yudalid and the Achila is Tesvav? There's two different zmanim, so what? That doesn't seem to explain why it should be two different mitzvahs. If HaPesach leiba mitchilasei ela la'achila, then even if it's in two zmanim, it should be one mitzvah, like Kriyat Shema, like the Korban Tamid, like the Codifies. They're two different zmanim, but it's still one mitzvah. So Mela, this kasha still remains. So, in short, to summarize, we explained why the kasha from Achila being ma'akiv is not a kasha, because the Achila tak is not ma'akiv. However, we still have the question from the fact that HaPesach leiba mitchilasei ela la'achila, so it should be one mitzvah, and the fact that it's two different zmanim doesn't seem to help. And we also have the questions from before, why the Rambam is meshana by Korbon Pesach from the way he structures the Korbanos everywhere else. Everywhere else he says there's three mitzvahs: Havas HaKorbon, Lasa is called Maaseh HaKorbon, and then the Achila, which the Achila, he includes all the Korbanos in one mitzvah. So why by Korbon Pesach, all of a sudden is he changing the system, and he has a mitzvah of Shechitas Se Pesach, and doesn't mention Havah, doesn't mention to do Kol Maaseh HaKorbon, and also he makes the Achila of Korbon Pesach a mitzvah b'fnei atzma, and he does not include that in the mitzvah of Achilas Kol HaKorbanos, which Achilas Kol HaKorbanos is included in one mitzvah. So why is Pesach not included in that? Why is Achilas HaPesach a mitzvah b'fnei atzma? So let's now talk about these last three questions. And this is all taken basically from the Ha'aris and the Sicha. It's not mamish mefurish klor, but kei nir elani is daiti from patching all the pieces together, that this is the pshat in the Rambam. So as we mentioned before, that the other Meinei HaMitzvahs, like the Bahag and the Yereim, they say that the mitzvah of Korbon Pesach is Kol Maaseh HaPesach. That includes Shchite, Zrike, Haktorah. And they bring a different pasuk for this mitzvah, the pasuk in Ba'aloischa of V'yasu b'nei Yisrael es HaPesach. So it makes sense. V'yasu b'nei Yisrael es HaPesach, the mitzvah is Kol Maaseh HaPesach. But the Rambam says no, the mitzvah is Shchitas HaPesach, Dafke Shchita, and he brings the pasuk from Parshas Boy, our Parsha, V'shachatu Oisei. So one of the questions that we asked is, L'chura, what happened to Kol Maaseh HaPesach? L'chura, there needs to be a mitzvah also, Las is Kol Maaseh HaPesach. If the mitzvah is only Shchita, so what, there's no mitzvah to do Kabbalah, Zrike, Haktorah? Obviously there is, because we know the Korbon Pesach, we don't just shech the Korbon Pesach, we do Zrikas Adam and we burn the Chelev on the Mizbeach. But if that's not in the mitzvah of Pesach, because the mitzvah of Pesach is only Shchitas HaPesach and not Lasos, Kol Maaseh HaPesach, so where does that come from? So this the Rebbe answers in the end of Ha'ara 32, and he says that this is already included in the Rambam in Mitzvos Samach Gimel, Samach Dalet, Samach Chei, Samach Vav. If you remember those mitzvahs, Samach Gimel, Samach Dalet, Samach Chei, Samach Vav, was to do Lasos Kol Maaseh HaKorbanos, and we had a mitzvah Samach Gimel for Oila, and then Samach Dalet for Chatos, and Samach Chei for Osham, and Samach Vav for Shlomim. And after that, the Rambam says that this includes Ve'elu Harba Maisim, Kloimer Maaseh Oila, Achatos, Osham, Ashlomim, Maaseh HaKorbanos Kulam. That this includes all korbanos, because these are the only 4 types of korbanos. And Be'emes, the Korbon Pesach, we know, is a Korbon Shlomim. Falls into the category of Korbon Shlomim. So B'meile, this is not a question. It's not a question, why is there no mitzvah by Korbon Pesach, Lasos, Kol Maaseh Korbon Pesach, because Korbon Pesach is a Korbon Shlomim, and there's already a mitzvah to do mitzvah samach vav shetzivonu sheyamaisa zevach hashlomim ala toyer hanizkar. So that includes the Korbon Pesach, which is a Korbon Shlomim. So we don't need a separate mitzvah. Last is Kol Maaseh HaPesach. So therefore, the Rambam says, what is the mitzvah then? The mitzvah by Korbon Pesach is the mitzvah of shchita, but there is a unique mitzvah to shech the Korbon Pesach. That is a mitzvah, and that's learned from the pasuk v'shachatu oisei. Since we have a pasuk mefureshes, v'shachatu oisei, so the Rambam learned that this v'shachatu oisei is a tzivui. It's a mitzvah. It's a mitzvah to shech the Korbon Pesach. Or in other words, what we'll say is that here the v'shachatu, the mitzvah of shchita, is equivalent to the mitzvah of hava. By other korbanos, we said that according to the Rambam, the mitzvah is lahavi hakorban, like by korban chatos, mitzvah on the owner to bring the hava. Havas hakorban. But by Korbon Pesach, and then there's also a mitzvah last is Kol Maaseh HaKorban. So by Korbon Pesach, we do have the same 2 inyanim. Just instead of the mitzvah being Havas HaKorban, lahavi hakorban, the mitzvah is Shchitas HaKorban. There's a special mitzvah to shech the Korbon Pesach. And in this, the Korbon Pesach is unique. By Korbon Pesach, there's a chayvas gavra of Shchitas HaPesach. Every individual yid is mechuyev, a chayvas gavra, to shech the Korbon Pesach. Which is why the Gemara in Kiddushin, in Daf Mem Aleph Amud Beis, Taka learns the din shlichus from here. The Gemara asks, how do we know that sheshluchah shel adam k'moisei? And the answer is from here. V'shachatu oisei kol kahal adas Yisrael bein ha'arbayim. And the Gemara asks the shaila v'chi kol hakol kulan sheichtin v'alei ena sheichet ela echad ela mikan sheshluchah shel adam k'moisei. So you see, midaf onkumen zu adin shlichus here, because every single individual is a chayvas gavra to shech the Korbon Pesach, and every person should be shechting a Korbon Pesach. So when one person is shechting on behalf of everybody, daf onkumen zu shluchah shel adam k'moisei midin shlichus, so that each person is mekayim the mitzvah and yoytze the mitzvah of shchitas HaPesach. So in this, Korbon Pesach is unique. This is the chidush of Korbon Pesach over all the other korbanos. By all the other korbanos, the chayvas gavra is lahavi, to bring a korban. You did an aveira, bring a korban. But the shchita, there's no chayvas gavra to shecht a korban. The truth is that this is a machlokes between Rashi and the Rambam. If you look in the Ha'aras and the Sicha, according to Rashi, it seems to be that there is a chayvas gavra to shecht by all kochim. But al kaponim l'shitas Rambam, this is how the Rambam learns that there's a chidush in Korbon Pesach over all the other korbanos. By all the other korbanos, the shechita is included in lases kol ma'aseh hakorban. Maybe it's a mitzvah on the kohanim, it's mitzvahs kohuna, but the chayvas gavra on the individual is lahavi hakorban. Bring the korban. The shechita, you have no chayvas gavra to shecht. The shechita is part of the ma'aseh hakorban. Lases kol ma'aseh hakorban. Ketayra and Iskar B'Tayra. That includes Shchita and Zerika and Aktara Soimurin. That's by all the other korbanos. Masha'enki by Korbon Pesach, the Rambam is Mechadish. The Rambam learns that there's a chidush here. The Torah, instead of saying there's a mitzvah lahavi Korbon Pesach, Havasa Korban, the Torah said no. By Korbon Pesach, the chayvas gavra is Shchita. Shchita sa Pesach. So the act of shechita, that's the chayvas gavra, that's the mitzvah. Then from shechita and onwards, from the Kabbalah, Zrika, and Aktara Soimurin, that, as we said, is included in mitzvah Samach Vav, Shetzivona Shiyamaisa Zavach Hashlom Malatoya Niska B'Torah. That's from after shechita, the rest of the process of Korbon Pesach, the Kabbalah, the Zrika, and Aktara Soimurin, that's not, as we said, included in the mitzvah of Shchitas HaPesach. That's part of the general mitzvah of Lasas Kol Ma'aseh Korban Hashlamim Ketayra and Iskar B'Torah. But the first act of Shchita by Korbon Pesach, the Rambam learns, is a mitzvah b'fnei atzma. It's a mitzvah miyuchedes, a chayvas gavra lishchait. Mashenkin by other korbanos, the mitzvah is only lahavi hakorban, and the Shchita is already included together with Kabbalah, Zrika, and Aktara Soimurin in the mitzvah of Lasas Kol Ma'aseh HaKorban Ketayra and Iskar B'Torah. So once we understand that, we are already beginning to see the beginning of the answer to the kasha of Reb Daniel Habavli. If the mitzvah by Korbon Pesach was to bring a Korbon Pesach, stam, bring a Korbon Pesach, havas HaKorban, then he would have a taina. Bibal does the gan HaPesach loiba mitchilasi elalachila. The whole point of a Korbon Pesach is lachila, so why would it be necessary to have two mitzvahs? To bring a Korbon Pesach and to eat a Korbon Pesach. Bringing the Korbon Pesach is for the achila. HaPesach loiba mitchilasi elalachila. So it should be one mitzvah. So he would be right. He would be onto something if the mitzvah of Korbon Pesach was havas hakorban, like it is by all the other korbanos. But once we see that the Rambam here by Korbon Pesach is onto something else, the Rambam saw something else by Korbon Pesach. There's a uniqueness in Korbon Pesach. There's a mitzvah dafka on shchita, a chayvas gavra on shchita, and we need to come on to shluchish l'adam k'maisai for all the yidden to be mekayim this mitzvah. So once the mitzvah nun hey is already not stam bringing the Korbon Pesach, rather it's something unique, something different, something mechudashtik in shchitas HaPesach. So we're already seeing now it is roi to be a mitzvah b'fnei atzma u'kumeisha yizbor lahala. But upon the point that we're making now is that the Rambam is learning in the mitzvah of Korbon Pesach a new vart, a new chidush, that the mitzvah is shchita. Agav and afkemina that will help explain, and we'll come back to this a little bit later. The Rebbe brings in the ha'oras from the Shagas Aryeh. The Shagas Aryeh writes an interesting thing, that the Torah says v'shachatu oisei bein ha'arbaim, that the mitzvah of shchitas HaPesach has to be bein ha'arbaim. Bein ha'arbaim, he says, is between chatzos and shkia. Bein ha'arbaim ends by shkia. But we know that lahalacha, the day only ends by tzeis HaKechavim, which means usually korbanos for korbanos, all korbanos have to be b'yom. All korbanos have to be b'yom, but usually you have until tzeis HaKechavim. That's korbanos in general. But by Pesach, since it says v'shachatu oisei bein ha'arbaim, so it has to be finished by shkia. But he goes on to say that that's dafke the shchita. The rest of the process, the Kabbalah, the Zrika, the Akhtara, Soimurin, you could do until Tesak Echavim. The Torah was only makbid v'shachatu oisei bein ha'arbaim. Only the shchita has to be bein ha'arbaim, which means before shkia. But the rest of the korban, the rest of the process, you could do take as long as it's day, which is until Tesak Echavim. So this fits perfectly in line with what we're saying. The Rambam holds that there's a unique mitzvah on the shchita, and that the Torah said v'shachatu oisei bein ha'arbaim, so the shchita has to be take bein ha'arbaim before shkia. The rest of the Korbon Pesach isn't mitzad v'shachatu, as we said. The rest of the Ma'aseh HaKorban, the Zrikas Adam and Akhtara Seimurin, is not mitzad the mitzvah of Shchitas HaPesach bein ha'arbaim. That, we said, is part of the general mitzvah Samach Vav, Sheyamaisa Zevach HaShlom Malat Toyer HaNizkar. So now that we're in the territory of regular Korban Shlomim stuff, you could do Ad Seis HaKechavim. So the Zrikas Adam and Akhtara Seimurin, there's no reason to do it before Shkia. That you could do until Tesak Echavim. But the Shechita has to be Bein Ha'arbaim, before Shkia. So we see here Mamish and Afkamina L'Poyel that explains this difference. The Shechita is the mitzvah of Korbon Pesach, but Mishchita Ve'elach, from Kabbalah Ve'elach, is no longer shaykh to the mitzvah of Korbon Pesach. It's already out the general mitzvah of bringing a Korban Shlom K'Torah Niskar B'Torah. Mashenkin by other Korbanos, as we said, the Shechita already starts in the general Maaseh of the Korban, and the Chayvas Gavra is only Lahavi. So now we need to understand what's the reason of the Rambam, what's the makar of the Rambam. Why was the Rambam mechadish that by Korbon Pesach there is this Chayvas Gavra, there's a mitzvah of Shechita. So the teretz with Pashtas is because of the pasuk v'shachatu oisei. It says v'shachatu oisei. So the Rambam learned there's a mitzvah of Shechita. But l'chura, this is not understood. And this is the way, what we're going to say now, is the way the Rebbe explains the kasha of the Mayan HaChachma in Ha'ara 32, Mechudesh Tikei Pshat. No, not Ha'ara 32, Ha'ara 23. Ha'ara 23, I think. Forgetting, I don't have it in front of me. But like upon him, in one of the Ha'aras, the Rebbe addresses what's the kasha of the Mayan HaChachma, and this is how he explains it. We understand, as we just said, that the Rambam learns that there's a mitzvah of shchita, unique mitzvah of shchitas ha-pesach, chayvas gav. Why? Because the pasuk says v'shachatu oisei. Stellt sich a shaila, who said v'shachatu oisei is the mitzvah? By other korbanos it also says shchita. By korban chatos it says tishachit achatos. And we understand because you have to do shchita. So by other korbanos it says tishachit achatos. Or it says shchita v'shachat oisei al yerech hamizbeach, but we never took that v'shachat to be a mitzvah. We understood it's a chelik of the process. Last is kol ma'aseh hakorban, and includes shchita. We didn't single out shchita to be a mitzvah b'fnei atzma, even though it says v'shachat by other korbanos. So why is it that by Korbon Pesach the Rambam all of a sudden says v'shachatu oisei, and he makes a big deal out of the shchita? He singles out the shchita. It's a mitzvah, a chayvas gavra of shchita. The Rambam should stick to the regular thing, either havas ha-korban, to bring a korban, last is kol ma'aseh ha-korban, like by all the other korbanos. It says shchita, it always says shchita. By all the korbanos it says shchita, and we don't make shchita into a mitzvah b'fnei atzma, into a chayvas gavra. So why by Korbon Pesach did the Rambam say, v'shachatu oisei, this is a mitzvah of shchita, chayvas gavra, v'shachatu oisei? L'chayr, what's pshat in the Rambam to make v'shachatu oisei into a mitzvah? So the answer to this question, and with this we're going to go back to the word of Rabbi Avram ben Harambam. The answer to this question is because the Torah didn't stam write v'shachatu oisei. The Torah didn't stam tell us to shech the Korbon Pesach. The Torah immediately after saying, or immediately next to saying, v'shachatu oisei, the Torah was kaveya the zman when you need to do this. The Torah says, ba'arba'asar, bein ha'arbayim, then is v'shachatu oisei. So that's the makar of the Rambam. That's how the Rambam knew that the shchita here has a chashivas b'fnei atzma. This v'shachatu isn't stam like by other korbanos where it says tishachit achatos. It's part of the process part of the procedure of the Korbon. The Rambam saw that by Korbon Pesach, since it doesn't just say V'shachatu oisai, but immediately next to saying V'shachatu oisai, it says the Zman when to do it. But Yudalet bein ha'arbayim. So that told the Rambam that here the Shechita is choshev b'fnei atzma. The Torah is machshiv this Shechita als inin b'fnei atzma. Because if this Shechita was nothing, if this Shechita was just part of the Maaseh HaKorbon, nothing special or nothing unique about this V'shachatu oisai, why is the Torah connecting the V'shachatu to a Zman? B'yudalid bein ha'arbayim. What's Negeya? The Shachatu should be whenever the Shachatu needs to be. So from the fact that the Torah was Keveya as man, right next to the V'shachatu, that the V'shachatu has to be B'yudalid bein ha'arbayim, that told the Rambam, now I can't just dismiss the Shechita as being a prat in the Maaseh HaKorbon. This Shechita is choshev b'fnei atzma. This Maaseh HaShechita, the fact that it has a Zman, the Torah gave it a Zman, when to do it, means that now this is a chayvas gavra. This is a mitzvah. V'shachatu oisei by Korbon Pesach is not a prat in the Maaseh HaKorbon. The v'shachatu oisei by Korbon Pesach is a mitzvah b'fnei atzma, chayvas gavra, lishchaitzeh Pesach b'yudalid. The Rambam knows this because it doesn't just say v'shachatu oisei. It says v'shachatu oisei b'yudalid bein ha'arbayim. The Torah putting the zman next to the tzivui of shechita, the zman, that's kiveya, that tells the Rambam that now the shechita is a chayvas gavra, is a choshev b'fnei atzma, is actually a mitzvah b'fnei atzma. So this is already sounding very similar to the word of Rabbi Avram ben Rambam, and this is the key to unlocking the shita of the Rambam and to understanding and answering all the questions that we asked before. So let's go back now to the questions and see how each of them are answered. The kasha first of Reb Daniel HaBabli. Right? Reb Daniel HaBabli says, since HaPesach leba mitchila say elo la'achila, so it should be one mitzvah. Why do we have two mitzvahs? To shecht and a mitzvah to eat. It should be one mitzvah. So now we understand. And that's what Rabbi Avram ben Rambam was saying. Since the Torah didn't stam say to make a Korbon Pesach and eat it, but rather next to each one the Torah gave the Zman. By Shechita it said, V'shachatu oisei b'yudalid bein ha'arbayim. And by Achila it said, V'achlu es habasa b'laylo hazeh. The Zman that's written next to each of these mitzvahs, that tells us that each one is choshev b'fnei atzma, and each one is a mitzvah b'fnei atzma. Because if it's one mitzvah, we have to either say one of two things: that the ikar mitzvah is the korban, and then the achila which comes after is just sort of a hashlama to the achila, to the korban, like normal korbanos. By normal korbanos, the ikar is the korban, and then you have to eat it after. That's like a hashlama to the korban itself. Or we have to say, by Korbon Pesach, that since HaPesach leba mitchila say elo la'achila, so fakir, the ikar is the achila, and the korban is a hachana. Right, that's if you want to make it into one mitzvah, you got to say one or the other. You have to either say the ikar is the korban and the achila later is mashlim, or you have to say fakir, the ikar is the achila and the korban before is the hachana. So then it wouldn't make sense. Why is the Torah keveya as man for each one? Be keveya as man by the ikar, by the main component, and the other one follows naturally. If the main component is the korban, so say, bring the korban and write the zman for bringing the korban. And then the achila, which comes later, which is mashlim, is like a regular korban. You eat it later. Always, the night after. You bring the korban b'yoyim and you eat the korban the night after. Or if the ikar is the achila, so be keveh the zman for the achila. The achila is belel tesvav. And the korban will be whenever you have to bring the korban. If you want to eat lel tesvav, so b'derech memela, you have to bring the korban the day before. So if it's meant to be one mitzvah, if Korbon Pesach is meant to be one mitzvah, it wouldn't make sense for the Torah to be kaveya a separate zman, one zman by the shechita and one zman by the achila. Be kaveya the zman for the main component, and the other one, which is either the hashlama or the hachana, follows naturally from whenever it's supposed to be, like by regular korbanos. So mized, the Torah didn't do that. The Torah was keveya by shechita ezman v'shachatu oiseh biyudalid bein ha'arbayim. And then by achila, the Torah again was keveya ezman v'achlu es habasar b'laylo hazeh. So that tells me that each one is a mitzvah b'fnei atzma. The shechita is not a hachana to the achila. I'm not only shechting biyudalid also hachana to eating it on Tesvav. I'm shechting it because today is Yudalid Bein Ha'arbayim, and Yudalid Bein Ha'arbayim, the Zman is Goyrem, a Chiyuv, a mitzvah of Shichos Korbon Pesach. That's one mitzvah. And then when it comes to Achilas Korbon Pesach, B'Leil Tesvav, I'm not only eating the Korbon Pesach on Leil Tesvav, because we have a Korban and you're supposed to eat a Korban. It's regular Achilas Kochim. No. I'm not eating it as a regular Achilas Kochim. I'm eating it because tonight is Leil Tesvav. V'achlu es habasar b'laylo hazeh. Leil Tesvav, the Zman is Goyrem. There's a mitzvah of Achilas Korbon Pesach. So that's why the Rambam said it's two different mitzvahs. So that's the word of Rabbi Avram ben HaRambam. It's not only the fact that they are in two different zmanim. The fact that they are in two different zmanim, that's not the word. Also, we said Krishma is in two different zmanim, Tomid, Ketores are in two different zmanim. The word is that the Torah was keveya the zmans for each one separately. So not that it is in a different time, but that the Torah was keveya each step with an accompanying time next to it. That tells us that the two steps are not there to be mashlim each other. If the two steps were there to be mashlim each other, we wouldn't need a kviyas man for each one separately. Be keveya one's man for both together. Or be keveya one's man for the ikir, and the other one will follow, either as a achana or as a hashlama, as we said before. But the fact that the Torah was keveya as man separately for each one, that tells us that they're not here to be mashlim each other. They're not two different parts of the same inyan. Each one is a mitzvah b'fnei atzma. When it comes Yudaled Bein Ha'arbayim, that zman is goyrem a mitzvah. That zman is goyrem a chiyuv b'fnei atzma. Forget about Tesvav, without even looking at what's going to happen later. Haint is Yudaled Bein Ha'arbayim v'shachatu. That's a mitzvah. And then al derech ze'achila, when it comes Leil Tesvav, the zman of Leil Tesvav, achlas habasar b'laylo hazeh. B'laylo hazeh is goyrem a mitzvah of achilas Korbon Pesach. Not because you have a korban from before and there's a mitzvah to eat korbanos. Not a hashlama to what happened before. It's a mitzvah b'fnei atzma. Leil Tesvav, the zman is goyrem a mitzvah b'fnei atzma. So that's how we answer the kasha of Reb Daniel HaBabli. And this also explains why Korbon Pesach, Achilas Korbon Pesach, is not nichlal in the regular mitzvah of Achilas Kochim. Because we're not eating the Korbon Pesach als a regular Achilas Kochim. If it was a regular Achilas Kochim, the Torah wouldn't say V'achlu es habasar b'laylo hazeh. Because you would eat the korban whenever you meant to eat the korban. Like by all korbanos. Whenever you meant to eat it, you eat it. So Korbon Pesach, you would also eat it whenever you meant to eat it. The fact that the Torah was kevei V'achlu es habasar b'laylo hazeh, that man tells me that I'm not eating the Korbon Pesach als Achilas Kochim. I'm eating Korbon Pesach als a mitzvah achilas Korbon Pesach as a mitzvah b'fnei atzma. So this answers all the questions. Answers the kasha of Reb Daniel HaBabli, why it's two different mitzvahs. And we explained why the mitzvah is dafka shchita, not hava. And we explained why the mitzvah of achila is a mitzvah b'fnei atzma, not part of the regular mitzvah of achilas kochim. And with this, all of the questions are addressed. And we've completed the first three seifim of the Sicha. And hopefully now you have a better and deeper understanding of the Oimek Shittas HaRambam in the mitzvah of Shechita and Achilas Korbon Pesach and the Chiddush of the Rebbe in understanding the Sugya.